Good evening. I'm Janet Jacobson. I'm the director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women. And I would like to welcome you to this evening's lecture, which is the annual Helen Pond McIntyre Lecture in Women's Studies. And we are very happy to have with us the distinguished scholar Dorothy Roberts this evening. Dorothy Roberts is the Penn Integrates Knowledge, George A. Weiss University Professor, with a joint appointments in the Department of Sociology, the Law School, and Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, where she also holds the inaugural Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Mossell Alexander Chair. As many of you know, Dorothy Roberts is an acclaimed scholar of race, gender, and the law, and her path-breaking work in law and public policy focuses on urgent contemporary issues in health, social justice, and bioethics, especially as they impact the lives of women, children, and African Americans. She has written several major books, and I think each one is in itself a landmark, as well as just dozens and dozens of law review articles and other articles and essays. The books, I think, are going to be familiar to many of you. They certainly are to us here at Barnard College. In particular, Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty was published in 1997. This is a book that looks at the intersection between race and gender around the question of reproductive justice. And as someone trained in ethics, the thing that I find most important about this particular book is that it holds together the value of liberty with the value of equality. As many of you know, in American politics, it is all too easy to split liberty from equality, to think that in order to be free, we must be unequal, or in order to be equal, we must somehow become unfree. And this book proves that wrong in a nutshell. And around issues that are very important to women's lives. Her second book, Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, was published in 2002. And as you can see, one of the things that's particularly striking about Professor Roberts' work is the way that she's able to connect issues that have been central to social movements to each other. So the connections between reproductive justice and child welfare are, like liberty and equality, often separated from each other. And yet, if we follow the course of Professor Roberts' work, what we find is that these things must be held together. If we are going to address one, if we are going to address the politics of reproduction, we must also be able to address the other, the politics of child welfare. She's here this evening to talk about this book, which I carry around because I think it's so important, which is Fatal Invention: How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century. The thesis of this book is that race was invented, and she shows the history at the start of the book of the invention of race in the 16th century, and that yet this invention could be undercut or essentially done away with by science, and in particular by genetic science, that there are all kinds of studies which show us that the genetic differences that are supposed to adhere to race, in fact, do not do so, and that the differences across genes are striking in their variability in ways that cannot be tracked through the type of social groupings that we generally associate with race. And yet, what we find is instead a series of scientific interventions that purport to show us the ways in which race is not only genetic, but the genetics of race determines virtually everything about our lives, and in particular our health. Fortunately, we have Dorothy Roberts here this evening to show us why not only that is a mistake, but that if we take seriously the invention of race and an intervention into the science of race, we will perhaps move toward a land of freedom, justice, and equality for all. Dorothy Roberts.
Oh, thank you so much for that pithy introduction that's so well captured, maybe even better than I will tonight. So much of what I want to say, that was a great ending to the introduction. And thanks so much to the Barnard Center for Research on Women for inviting me to give this very distinguished lecture. I'm very, very honored by it. So I am going to talk about an aspect of my new book, Fatal Invention. Given that this is Barnard College and the Center for Research on Women, I wanted to highlight the intersection of race and gender in the resurgence of genetic definitions of race that I see happening now in the US. So I'll start with an example of how consumers are being brought into the new genomic age at a very personal level. And this is a picture of a spit party that was thrown by the direct-to-consumer genetic testing company 23andMe during Fashion Week in New York in 2008. And one of the interesting things about it is that this was reported in the New York Times, not in the science section or the business section, but in the style section. And the point of it was to promote this genetic testing company and, to add a little glamour to it and to convince the public, I guess, that it's really glamorous to test your genes. And one component of it was that couples could get their DNA tested, and this couple joked that maybe the results might determine whether or not they would get married or not, because if it showed that either one of them was going to pass down, defective genes to their children, then maybe they wouldn't be a suitable partner. So I think this is just one brief example of what some people are calling biological citizenship, which means a lot of different things, but the way in which I'm using it relies heavily on Nicholas Rose's definition, where he points out that our very life itself has entered the domain of decision and choice because we now, with genetic testing and other scientific developments and technologies, can take control of our very lives at the molecular level. And people can associate with each other and with doctors and with science based on this new ability to manage not only our health, but other aspects of our lives through genetic knowledge and genetic testing. I disagree with Nicholas Rose about whether we should, this is a completely wonderful thing that we should celebrate, but I do think that he's onto something, that there is a way in which the technologies that are marketed to all of us are marketed as ways of taking control of our lives, that making us more autonomous and also giving us a way to associate with other people based on knowledge at the molecular level. Now, one aspect of this ability to associate with people based on genes that some are promoting is that we can now overcome race because we will align with others based on genotype, genetic similarity and difference, as opposed to the invented category of race. So the founder of 23andMe, for example, says, if you want to associate with people based on a genetic mutation, you've got a predisposition to a particular genetic disease, you can find out other people who have that based on genetic testing. And on the 23andMe website, you can even join communities, virtual communities, based on genetic predisposition. So this promises perhaps to undo race. In fact, just before we met here, we had a meeting with some journalists, and I won't identify, it was confidential, I won't identify anyone's name, but one of them said to me, well, do we really have to worry about the resurgence of concepts of biological race? Because pretty soon, everyone will be able to scan their entire genetic sequence, and we won't need race anymore. So this is a pretty popular idea that genetic science is going to overcome race. President Clinton and, in fact, Francis Collins and Craig Venter, the leaders of the Human Genome Project, Collins, the public project, and Venter, the private project, all made a point of saying that mapping the human genome showed that race doesn't exist at the molecular level. And Clinton famously declared when the draft of the human gene map was unveiled that in 2000, that in genetic terms, all human beings, regardless of race, are more than 99.9% the same. And he meant this to say, we are so genetically alike as human beings, we can't be broken down according to race genetically. That simply confirmed what many evolutionary biologists, geneticists, anthropologists, sociologists, historians had been saying for decades, that race is an invented political system, a social grouping that was created to support European enslavement of other peoples and colonization of other people. It is not a natural biological division. The way that we break down human beings according to race, the way that we identify who belongs to one race or another, that is all according to made-up rules. Legal rules, cultural rules, social rules, political rules, but it's not written in our genes. And so all of these statements about new genetic technology showing that race is not a natural division merely are confirmations of what we knew even before the mapping of the human genome, that race is invented, it's not natural. So, after all the scientists at the unveiling of the human gene map and President Clinton, declared that there was absolute confirmation that race wasn't a genetic category, many people thought, finally, we've done away with this idea that the human species is naturally divided into these categories of Black, white, Asian, Native American, what am I leaving out? Australian Aborigine, maybe. There's something I'm leaving out. Some people say Hispanic. That's not natural. And that geneticists then would turn their attention to a new way of understanding human genetic variation that didn't rely on these typologies that came out of the 17th century. But instead, what happened was right on the heels of the unmapping of the Human Genome Project, scientists started doing just the opposite, looking for genetic differences between human races. As Nicholas Way declared in the New York Times in only 2001, the human genome had just been mapped. He could have declared that the next phase was a new science of human genomics, freed from the chains of the archaic typologies of race. Instead, he says that the next phase of the Human Genome Project, scientists were forced. They had to confront this issue, the genetic differences between human races, assuming that there are human races, and he uses this language all the time, the principal human races he likes to use in his articles, and that there were genetic differences between them, and that scientists could find those genetic differences and that this was a plausible next phase of the human genome project. Not only plausible, they had to face this. If you were a genetic scientist, you had to look into this. So what I and others looking into the genomic and genetic science and technologies coming out of it have discovered is that actually Nicholas Way kind of predicted for many scientists what their next project would be, and that there has been a big expansion of race-based science and technology since 2000. Race used as a category in biomedical and population genomics research, the development of race-specific medicines, race used in reproduction assisting technologies, which I'm going to talk about some more, race used in ancestry testing, including companies that claim to be able to tell you what race you are or what combination of races you are, and race coming up in law enforcement use of DNA and DNA forensics, both to determine the race of a perpetrator who left a crime scene sample, but also race being a prominent part of big DNA databases that increasingly include the DNA of people who are only arrested for crimes because of the huge racial bias in arrests and convictions in this country. So these DNA databases are made up of disproportionate numbers of Black and Latino genetic profiles, making them permanent suspects. Again, even people who haven't even been convicted of committing a crime, just arrested by the police. So I was very perplexed, I must say, when I first started reading articles like Nicholas Wade's, going to lectures where prominent scientists were talking about finding racial differences in the genes, searching for the African gene for asthma or hypertension, for example. And also the way that race was so prominent in reproductive health technologies and policies. And so I wanted to ask, why is race and reproduction so central to technologies that were supposed to free us from the artificial barriers of race? If it was declared that race wouldn't matter to us anymore with genetic technologies, that these technologies were supposed to liberate us, give us greater control over our lives, form a new basis of citizenship, then why is it that in every single aspect of the technologies that were supposed to facilitate this new biological citizenship, race played such a central factor? And reproduction also was important because, I think partly because people really think of race as being reproduced through procreation. And so it is people associate race and reproduction very, very closely. So my journey led me to write this book, Fatal Invention: How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century. And in that book, I argue that we're witnessing a new biopolitics in this country that relies on scientists redefining race as a biological category written in our genes, biotech companies and pharmaceutical companies then converting this new racial science into race-specific products, And by that, I don't mean that they're actually necessarily taking scientific discoveries and using them to create race-specific products, as I'll get to in a minute. You could create a race-specific product without any scientific basis for showing that it needs to be race-specific. Part of this new biopolitics also involves biocitizens, or citizens now who are expected to take advantage of genetic technologies to manage their own lives. There is another side of that, which is not just that it gives you the freedom to use them, but that you're expected to take full responsibility of your own and your future children's welfare by consuming gene-based goods and services. And I'll talk more about that in a minute, too. And then all of this happening in the context of officially colorblind policies that are not supposed to pay attention to race. Some people believe they shouldn't pay attention to race because there's no more racism in our society to have to worry about. And so, a majority of justices on the US Supreme Court look at race that way, that race-conscious policies directed at overcoming or eliminating social inequality based on race are unconstitutional because they shouldn't take race into account. So we've got some scientists saying we need to be race conscious at the molecular level, where we have many policymakers saying we shouldn't pay attention to race anymore at the social level. On top of neoliberal policies that are pushing services out of the hands of government into the private realm of the market and the family, with a philosophy that the government shouldn't be involved in your life. This should sound familiar now from the presidential debates. The government's role is to help corporations keep their wealth, while citizens and others are supposed to fend for themselves on the market and take care of themselves. And the idea of biocitizenship that relies on genetic technologies to manage your own health fits perfectly into this neoliberal philosophy. And I must add, though, that the neoliberal philosophy is not just about the government leaving the public realm. It also is accompanied by a huge intervention of government into communities of color, especially poor communities of color, in the form of mass incarceration, welfare policies that are basically behavior modification policies to try to get poor women on welfare to get married and take low-wage work, deportation of unauthorized immigrants in the country. So very brutal intervention by government at the same time as more and more government is saying we have to slash these services and people need to take care of themselves. So let me say a little bit about some of the flawed science that goes into this view that race is a genetic category that explains health inequities in this country. And just by giving an example of a study that wanted to explain why it is that Black women are more likely than white women to have premature babies. And the hypothesis was that Black race, independent of other factors, increases the risk of extreme preterm birth and its frequency of recurrence. Because of time. I could spend a lot of time dissecting this, but hopefully you will see some of the flaws with the hypothesis itself, which I don't even think should have been published. But black race, what is that? What does it mean to be of the black race, independent of other factors? And how could black race increase premature births? Who in the study belongs to the black race? How are they going to identify who is the black race and who's the white race? All of that not answered in the study. But they controlled for a few variables like welfare receipt, found that the black women still had higher rates of premature birth, and concluded that there was a genetic reason, that black women were predisposed to premature birth for genetic reasons. And I just had to add that they then postulated about the reason why, and it's because there's some selective advantage to black people, unexplained. This is just total concocted theory that for some reason black people would be advantaged by having their babies die in the first year. Doesn't make any sense, but you'd say, well, goodness, how did that get published? But not only did it get published, it gets a headline in the New York Times, which, if you didn't read the study, you would think that the study really did show that genetics is the explanation for disparities in preterm births. All right, that was a kooky theory. You might say, oh, well, nobody would publish anything like that again, except I just have to show you that in January, the New York Times had a big spread, the front page of the Science Times, genome study points to adaptation in early African Americans. Meaning those brought here in chains, a few hundred years ago, that somehow African Americans adapted to the harsh environment in America by becoming predisposed to disease. Certain disease-causing variant genes became more prominent in African Americans after their ancestors reached American shores. Note this common hypothesis, perhaps because they conferred greater offsetting benefits. Again, look at the study, absolutely no support for this theory. And it not only was prominently displayed with a headline, but it got this etching of the slaves working with, the disease-causing variants somehow increasing among them in a couple centuries. No explanation why the white slave owners in the back didn't have a similar reaction to the harsh environment when they came from the northern climates of Europe to America. Okay. I mentioned that there are also race-specific medicines that are part of this expansion of race consciousness at the genetic level. And this is an ad for Bidil, the first drug approved by the Food and Drug Administration for marketing to a specific racial group. I, again, don't have time to go into all the details, but this was a drug that was originally designed for anyone, any heart failure patient who could benefit from the combination of two generic drugs that dilate the blood vessels and make it easier for the heart to pump blood. It works that way in human bodies. But the cardiologist needed a second patent to extend the first patent that had nothing to do with race, added that it was a drug for African Americans. The Food and Drug Administration approved it based on a clinical trial that only included African Americans. So I could go on and on about this drug, but I want to get to reproduction assisting technologies. And this is just to show you that in addition to prescribed medications, there are over-the-counter medications that are race-based. This a vitamin where if you read the label, the distinction between the vitamins for different races is the amount of vitamin D in the formula. So the theory is that race is a proxy for genetic difference. This was the theory that the company that manufactured Beidel used, arguing that there were ethnic differences in the underlying pathophysiology of heart failure, and that's why Beidel would work better for black people. And the chair of the FDA Advisory Committee just point blank saying we're using self-identified race as a surrogate for genetic difference. Now, that then is treated as a step toward personalized medicine. Newspapers treated Beidel as if it somehow had something to do with pharmacogenomics or the development of drugs that are tailored to an individual's genotype. Personalized medicine, same thing. Even the FDA, in its press release, called Beidel a step toward the promise of personalized medicine. Again, as if knowing someone's race can tell you what their genes are. This is coming from the federal agency that approves drugs for marketing in the United States. As I told you, Beidel had nothing to do with genes, let alone personalized medicine. A law professor, Jonathan Kahn, has shown that there has been a huge increase in the use of race and ethnicity in gene-related patent applications, and showing that Beidel may be used as a model, even though this drug flopped, but it could be used as a model for other pharmaceutical companies to gain advantage in patent protection and drug approval. Okay, I'm going to move a little bit ahead because I took too long on those New York Times articles probably, just to give some resolution to this issue of race as a proxy for genetic difference, and whether it makes sense to search for genetic explanations for race-based health disparities, that I think we should think about race not as a biological category that naturally produces health disparities because of genetic differences, but understand it as a political category that does have biological consequences, not because people of different races have different disease predispositions based on race, but because of the impact of social inequality on people's health. Okay, now let me turn to high-tech reproduction and the way in which these ideas about biological citizenship and race have influenced advances in reproduction-assisting technologies. And I want to look at medical markets in gametes, that is, markets in eggs and sperm, genetic testing, especially pre-implantation genetic diagnosis that tests embryos for the presence of certain genetic disorders and allows for the selection just of those that aren't predicted to have those disorders, and surrogacy and the development of reproductive tourism with middle-class couples from the US and Europe going to primarily India, but other countries as well, to hire surrogates. Now, this is the kind of image, actually, which is still very prominent in the marketing of reproductive technologies, but was even more so. When I wrote Killing the Black Body, all the images of high-tech reproduction were like this. Lots of white babies, very idealized images of especially blue-eyed, blonde babies, coming out of the clouds. This is iconic. What these technologies promised to our society, which is the production of white babies. In fact, Now, on this website, these images are scrolling across the screen. So it's like you just see lots and lots of white babies, coming past. And it's called the success stories. And they're, as far as I can tell, they're all white babies. And, the more groups of them are even better. And you can just ask yourself, would a company in the US market, lots and lots of black babies, its services with lots and lots of black babies scrolling across the screen? Very unlikely. And in the media also, if you think about these movies that are about, they're scary, but they are about genetic perfection. And they usually have blonde-haired, blue-eyed actors in the lead. But one thing that's changing since between my writing Killing the Black Body and Fatal Invention, the complexion of these ads have changed a lot, and the websites, so that now on Craigslist there are explicit references to people of color being solicited, especially for eggs, and so that's a big change that I think we have to think about. What that means for the traditional feminist dystopia about high-tech reproduction, with just wealthy white women using it and women of color being exploited by it, which some of that still remains true, but there more and more women of color are being seen as those who use these technologies as well. They're still less likely to use them, especially if they're poor, but part of the culture and the images of these technologies includes women of color. Just another example of a Craigslist advertisement seeking, East Indian, Middle Eastern, Asian, Italian donors. Race also, race is extremely prominent in these ads. Whatever their implications, race is absolutely at the forefront of seeking an egg and sperm donor. Nobody, well, I shouldn't say nobody, very few people will pick an egg or sperm donor without knowing the race, and race is the number one thing people look for, and the catalogs are all divided by race. In addition, at least one fertility clinic advertised that it was able to select the skin color of embryos, so that in pre-implantation genetic screening, this doctor promised he could determine the color of the child, and you could select embryos based on color. And some of you may be familiar with this case of the family that sued a fertility clinic because the baby came out the wrong color. They wanted a baby that was lighter, like the one all the way to your right, and instead they got the baby in the middle. Now, part of the harm to them was that the fertility clinic apparently used an African ancestry man's sperm instead of the white husband's sperm. And so the baby came out darker, although the mother's from the Dominican Republic. And I mean, I can look at my own family. My kids are all different colors, that we all know that you don't know what color your child is going to come out. So there's no guarantee in any of this. But yes, there was a harm that they used the wrong sperm. But what was the harm they claimed was specifically the harm that she looked different from the rest of the family because of her skin color. So this is maybe an extreme example, though, of how race continues to be important in this biological citizenship that gives us control, but control to do what? And what are the consequences when our attempts to control the traits of our children don't work? Race is also used in clinics' determination of the likelihood that a baby will have certain chromosomal problems, again, treating it as a biological category. And in all of this, again, this promise that these technologies are going to liberate us, give us more choices. I really want to contest whether that is necessarily the case, because if the government is absenting itself, divesting itself of responsibility for ensuring a healthy public, and we are expected to use these technologies to ensure our health and the health of our children, this may become an obligation, and it's going to become an obligation for women. They are the ones, or we are the ones. I'm done having babies. Maybe that's why I say they. I didn't include myself in the we. But women are the ones who are going to be the managers of genetic risk in their children and be expected to make certain decisions. Already, women report, pregnant women report, that they are steered toward genetic testing without even knowing why they're getting it. And if they decide not to use genetic testing or don't have an abortion, if the test proves positive for some chromosomal disorder, they are chastised, many, by their doctors or nurses or others, family members. And then there's this question of whether the government might say, well, you didn't use the genetic test, or you didn't make the right decision based on the genetic test, so we have no obligation to provide health and other care for your child who has a disability as a result of a genetic problem. I know when I taught this issue in my seminar last year, there were students in my class. Now, granted, these were law students who maybe tend to be extra conservative, but they said, well, yeah, why should taxpayers pay for care for a child if the mother could have avoided having that child? So this could be a reason to not provide health care for certain women, and more and more genetic testing is being incorporated into public health care services. It's important to remember that even though Medicaid in most states won't pay for fertility treatment or high-tech reproduction, because many legislators would not support assisting a low-income or poor woman to have a child, they might support genetic testing, which would assist a poor or low-income woman not to have a child who will be considered a burden to society. So I think we have to really be vigilant about the direction that biocitizenship goes and whether it's going to be used as further reason not to support the health needs of poor and low-income people in this country. And then I'm just going to use this as an example. This could warrant many lectures in and of itself, but an example of how a reproductive hierarchy could be maintained or is maintained despite advances in reproductive technology, which is very much like those 1980s reproductive dystopias, is what's been called reproductive tourism, or middle-class, affluent people leaving the US and Europe to go to India to hire surrogates at cut-rate fees, high salaries in India, but much less than what they would pay in the United States, with women highly, highly regulated in clinics where they are gestating babies for others. While this money can be used to improve the living standards of their families, but right now their families are living in very different standards than the very antiseptic and regulated clinics where they're performing this service for others. So all of this is going on, as I mentioned before, in a context of increasing promotion of colorblind social policies, and some conservative commentators have picked up on this. This distinction between colorblindness in society and race consciousness at the molecular level. With Sally Satel, who boasted about how she treats her patients by race and gives psychiatric medications, lower doses to Black people than other people, that she says that social race, she distinguishes between social race and biological race. Same with her colleague, John Entine, who wrote Taboo, Why Black Athletes Dominate at Sports and Why We're Afraid to Talk About It. He similarly kind of dismisses race and society or diversity, which isn't important. But what's really important is racial differences at the genetic level, which he says have huge consequences in everything from sports performance to success in the classroom. Again, note, the subtext of this is the reason why Black children do well at basketball but poorly in the classroom isn't because of social race and diversity. That doesn't matter. It's because of their genes. They're predisposed to being good on the basketball court and bad in the classroom. And there's also a way in which many liberals who would never say, what Sally Satel and John Entine said, also, though, see racial science as good science, and the only problem is if it gets in the hands of racists. So, we shouldn't worry about using race as a biological category, genetic category in scientific research and pharmaceuticals. We should only worry about the redneck racist use of biological concepts of race. So, in short, what they're saying is racial differences are real at the molecular level, but merely constructed in society. Genetic race is scientific truth, but social race is just ideology. Really turning the idea of the social construction of race on its head. So, I'll put up for a minute Evelyn Hammond's wonderful insight, and others have, especially those who've studied the eugenics era, have pointed this out as well, that what's so appealing about linking race and medical and scientific progress is that it makes racial inequality seem natural. That was the point of eugenics, and many people don't like, to say that we have eugenics in our society, to compare what I've been talking about with eugenics, but that, whatever you want to call it, that philosophy, that way of thinking about the world that says that social problems are caused by biology, and that the answer then is to medicalize the problem, treat the problem with drugs or with other, during the eugenic years, with sterilization. Many people are still advocating that today. That underlying philosophy is, I think, what is so dangerous about treating health inequities as if they stem from genetic difference. So I want to end, though, with on a positive note, which is that one development that I've been very encouraged by is the way in which this combination of neoliberal, program slashing and support of corporate interests, along with a resurgence of genetic concepts of race, have brought different groups of advocates, or are starting to bring different groups of advocates that may not have seen their common interests together, now seeing that there is a common thread to their work in this view that the social injustices they've been fighting against are really caused by genetic difference. And so I've had opportunities to work with alliances of people in the reproductive justice movement, gender justice, anti-racism, disability rights, economic justice, environmental justice, and other movements that are coming together to figure out new ways of thinking about human diversity, human commonality, and how to fight these trends of neoliberalism and genetic explanations for social inequality in order to find a new path that can truly address the persistent inequalities in our country and around the world, and lead. I'll end it on it may sound over the top, but I think it really is a way to lead to a world of greater equality and humanity. So I'll end there and be happy to take questions and comments.
You mentioned, much of your lecture was dedicated to kind of putting down this theory that looking at genetics through a race lens is productive or can even lead to anything or legitimate. I just kind of want to know the other side. What is the extent of the legitimacy of doing that kind of research?
You want me to play devil's advocate or tell you what is legitimacy? I guess, okay, so maybe one way to answer your question is, number one, why are people looking in that direction? Because I think there are scientists like the one I quoted under liberal racial science, or whatever I called it, Esteban Burchard at University of California in San Francisco. I interviewed him for my book. I think he really is interested in finding out why Black and Latino children, African American, Latino, and Puerto Rican children have higher rates of severe asthma, for example. So one way of interpreting your question is, why are people looking for race-based genetic difference? Another way of answering the question is or interpreting the question, because I'm not going to give an argument I think is wrong. So another way of interpreting is there some way of looking at genetic difference that's helpful to improving health, curing disease? So as to the first, I think that many people, even if they on one level understand that race is socially constructed, that race is understood in many different ways depending on the particular society and time of history, that who belongs to one race or another depends on social rules and customs. Even though they understand that, I found that many people still feel that underneath that interpretation, there really are these fundamental differences between people that we call races. And maybe we need to come up with a different term. Maybe we need to refine it a little bit. But human beings really are divided up into these groups. Or they feel that, what just their experience in the world tells them that white people are really different from black people, or really different from Asian people. And so they have a sense that even if they've learned about the social construction of race, they sort of intellectually embrace that, they can't get around their experience that there are these big differences. And so I think many people, including scientists who, after all, were raised just like the rest of us in this world where race has a huge influence on everything about everybody's lives, that it's hard to get away from that. And in my book, I talk about some research done by an anthropologist named Duana Fulwiley, who's now at Stanford, where she went into Esteban Burchard's lab, and she found that in his lab, the researchers talked about black and white groups of genes or haplotypes as opposite. Now, where would you get that? That's not scientific at all. Where would you get, the only place you can get that from is society, and the big differences in the welfare of groups, in the status of groups. There's nothing genetically that would make blacks and whites opposites of each other, but these genetic researchers thought that way. They were influenced by their social experience, and I think that's one reason why. There's also pressures in terms of funding and business opportunities and that kind of thing too, that pushes people toward race-specific medicines and which require supposedly race-specific scientific findings. Then as to the second interpretation of your question, isn't there something there, some reason to study genetic difference? Well, yeah, it is the case that genes are related to health, and that genes, the people have a greater likelihood, all things being equal, based on their genes, of getting a disease. Of course, it's hugely influenced by their environment in every level, from their, inside their body to the whole environment outside their body. And it's also true that genes, that different populations are more or less likely to have certain genetic mutations. So there's some basis to looking at genetic difference as an explanation for differences in disease rates, and also looking at genetic differences as an important component in drug development. But there isn't a good reason, I would argue, and I think I'm well supported by lots of scientists, for using the political, the social category of race as a substitute for genetic difference. That is, I think, bad science. And so I think that holding on to those categories as a way of dividing up research subjects, or dividing up DNA in scientists' exploration of explanations for disease, cures for disease, actually hinders a more advanced and scientifically valid and productive way of thinking about the relationship between disease, genes, disease, and health.
I think this is a really interesting, I guess, manifestation of race, or very clear-cut race in a post-racial society. So I guess my question is, how has sort of the Human Genomic Project or medicalization been used to, or has it been, I guess, used to justify the disparities of people we see within the prison industrial complex and people actually being, are there any sort of genetic indicators that have been found in this sort of junk science to assume people of color are violent or people of color are drug users? I mean, and can you speak to that at all?
Yeah. So one concern about this use of race-based genetic difference to explain health inequities is that it will also be used to explain other inequities, like, I quoted John Entine, who used success in the classroom as an example to be explained by race-based genetic difference. Or you mentioned violence. Why is it that the prisons are filled with grossly disproportionate numbers of African Americans? So in addition to health, these other inequities, poverty is another. The bell curve is not that old a publication, a bestseller that explained differences in wealth and poverty as gene-based variation. So there's a long history of explaining other kinds of inequities as biologically caused. Whether even before genes were discovered, there were other biological indicators or biological causes that were pointed to by scientists. So today, one example is the MAOA gene mutation that some scientists say is the explanation for differences in violence. In fact, it was called the warrior gene because some of the early research was done in New Zealand, and it was supposedly an explanation of why men in New Zealand were violent. And more recently, it's been called the gang-banging gene, with scientists, one in particular, saying that he's shown that members of gangs are more likely to have the version that causes aggression or violence. That's just one example. I mean, there have been conferences that have been held on this topic of whether urban violence is caused by genes. I think right now there's a little more reluctance to have policies based on genetic theories of crime or poverty or poor performance in schools, but it could happen again. It's not, people often act as if the 1970s is ancient history, or even the 1980s is ancient history. It's not that long ago that books were published and articles were published in prominent journals that claimed that these inequities in our society were caused by genes. And there are examples of it now as well, and it could gain popularity. It's hard to say. I just think we should be vigilant about it and be willing to contest the studies that claim that this is the case. You know, there's all these studies coming out now that say that political persuasion is caused by genes, that, you know, what party you belong to is caused by genes. So just all sorts of, I mean, one recent one that claimed to link, I don't know if it's out yet. There's Alondra, do you know, there's this article that study that claims that the more genetic variation, the less civilization. I'm really condensing it, but of course there's more genetic variation among Africans. So they somehow link genetic variation to, you know, the more, the less civilized. I think, I'm not sure if it's been published, because I think there's a lot of controversy about the pre-publication already. But, you know, there are lots of these behavioral genetic studies that are being published. And so, you know, I think we do have to be concerned about this convergence of expansion of research on race-based genetic variation as an explanation for health inequities, alongside studies that are claiming to show genetic causes of all sorts of behaviors, including, you know, ideology and political beliefs and, you know, being civilized, that sort of thing. You know, both of them happening together, it's very easy to put two and two together and say, well, the explanation for the lower status of people of color, the higher involvement in the prison system, poorer performance in schools, all of those are caused by these race-based genetic differences that have been established in health. But they also, you know, cause these other problems as well. You know, if behavior is caused by genes and race-based differences cause health inequities, why not race-based genetic differences causing differences in behavior?
Is it problematic, or maybe is there an advantage to organizations who consider themselves racialized, like the Black Panther Party, to expose and kind of show how a disease has been racialized? In the 1970s, the Black Panther Party went on this really big initiative to expose the racializing of disease when it came to sickle cell, and exposing that the difference in funding or the difference in healthcare outcomes. Is it wrong for them to expose it, or is it an advantage to say that this is, in a sense, a racialized disease and should be funded by these racial organizations kind of idea? Is it a double kind of?
You know, it's interesting. I skipped over my slides about the Black support for BIDIL. Let's see. And yes, here we go. There were a number of Black organizations, members of the Black Congressional Caucus, the Black Cardiologists Association, the NAACP, that supported the FDA's approval of BIDIL. And that, you know, you might think that was reminiscent of the support of some Black groups in the 70s for more race-conscious attention to the health deprivations that Blacks experienced. Of course, Alondra Nelson's wonderful book on that topic of the Black Panthers, I think is really important to understand how Blacks and other people of color have fought for inclusion and recognition that our health has been so neglected. Now, as Donna Christensen said, she referred to the medical wrongs against African Americans for whom treatment has been denied and deferred for 400 years. But I think it's important, though, to again understand, well, how are we treating race in this advocacy? Are we treating it as a political group where we can acknowledge that we have experienced as a group exploitation, neglect, abuse, and we're fighting against it as a group? That's how I interpret the Black Panthers' fight for not just recognition of sickle cell disease, but a vast range of health equity issues. Same thing today with the reproductive justice movement, led primarily by women of color. I'm the chair of the board of the Black Women's Health Imperative. I've been a member for a long time. I believe that Black women should have an organization that fights for recognition of our particular interests and that fights for better health for Black women in this country, which requires policies that pay special attention to Black women because we experience certain oppressions that other women and men don't experience. But that's based on our recognition of the social inequities that have led to the poor health outcomes that Black women have. We don't argue that this is all happening to us because we're genetically predisposed to it. I mean, when we've got a big grant now from the CDC, I'm proud to say, to deal with higher rates of diabetes among Black women. Do you think we're going to treat it by saying, well, Black women are just genetically predisposed to diabetes, so we just need the drug, I guess, that's going to deal with our genetic predisposition? No, we recognize that the reason why Black women have higher rates of diabetes is because of the social environment we live under, including lack of access to good medical care, but I would say even more importantly, the stresses of various sorts that Black women face. Yes, because of our race as a political category, not race as a genetic predisposition toward it. So I absolutely agree that we have to pay attention to race in order to contest racism and racial inequities that persist, and even the impact of racism on health. And I think that you have to acknowledge that race makes a difference. I also believe in Black solidarity. I mean, I do. I believe that on certain issues, I associate with other people too. I have had alliances with people who aren't Black. Absolutely. But I also believe that there are certain issues where Black solidarity is important. And, I identify as a Black person, not because of my genes. I probably have more genes from other places than Africa. I identify as a Black person because of my solidarity with Black people. I absolutely believe in that. I don't think it's because I don't base it on biology and genetic affiliation. I base it on a more of a love and a commitment and moral reasons.
So you just said you identify as African American because of how you've lived your life, not because of genes.
Yeah.
And in one of the quotes that you had on a slide earlier, it said, these drugs are figured out because of self-identified race, right? So that comes into question, what if somebody identifies as African American, but is phenotypically not cast as that.
Yeah.
So I guess my main question
Yeah.
would be, if this whole system, whether it's trying to figure out like getting somebody's DNA and saying you're from this country when 99.9%, like that is obviously leaving so little room to decide where somebody ethnically is due to their own personal DNA.
Yeah.
Is this shaping, I guess, whiteness? Like, how can any of these drugs be marketed to? Are any of the drugs marketed to white people? Like, can that be a thing? Like, is it like, this is the white drug for kidney failure? Like, is that can that be a thing? Because it's so, it just seems so otherizing, like, in essence.
Yes,
Just to, like,
yes.
how does that play out?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I would say, now I haven't done a study looking at the studies, counting up how many are about the genetic predisposition of white people to certain diseases. My sense is that most of them are about people of color. And because there's, why is it that people of color are so sick? And much less about the predispositions of white people, except that there is quite a bit of interest in Ashkenazi Jewish women's greater likelihood to have the BRCA1 and 2 gene. By the way, is not the same thing as saying only Ashkenazi Jewish women will have that gene, or all Ashkenazi Jewish women will have that gene. Some people think about it that way. African American women, African descended women can also carry the BRCA1 and 2 mutations, as well as others. There's trying to get to the bottom of why is it that so many Latina women have this mutation, with some researchers saying, well, it must be that it comes from the southern Spain where they were mixing with Jews, and that's why. Now, really, some people have come up with that explanation, but it's because the gene is not restricted to a certain group. But anyway, that is, that's one exception. So it's an interesting question whether or not this research is going to lead to some refiguring of racial boundaries. Some people think that it will, is the quote from the founder of 23andMe I had at the beginning, that this is going to break down racial boundaries. Some people believe that if we were all tested, we'd find out we're all mixtures of different ancestries. And in the press, there's been quite a few stories about people who were tested and found out that they thought they were pure white, and they found out they had some African ancestry, or vice versa. Henry Louis Gates's specials have shown some of this. I just don't have that cheery view that somehow genetic testing is going to break down racial barriers. I just think about slave owners in the South who knew damn well that those children, those mulatto children, were their children. And it didn't make any difference. They still held them as slaves. They knew they were mixtures of their blood, and it didn't make a difference. The imperative to maintain a pure white race and to make sure that anybody with any African ancestry was held as a slave, that overcame even not just their knowledge, but their, what you might think would be some kinship feelings toward their children. Some did have those, but it didn't make a difference to the institution of race or slavery. So I don't think that just knowing these things will necessarily overcome an interest in maintaining racial demarcations. I think if it's going to be something else. I think we know that across U.S. history and around the globe, racial demarcations have shifted. Even in the U.S. in 400 years, they shifted. And we know, you can go to another country and the racial demarcations are different. The census categories, have changed 20 times since they were first, or more than 20 times. Every 10 years they changed the categories. I wonder sometimes if now the census includes people of Middle Eastern ancestry as white. Might that change as feelings about differences of people from the Middle East develop? So I think if there's going to be a change, it's going to be based on politics, not on information about genes, which of course means that there could be a positive change based on politics too. I just don't think genetic knowledge by itself is going to be what makes the difference.